Hi, welcome to the Small Shed. This Saturday we're going on a trip to the spiritual home of the Small Shed. See you in a minute. So just after I'd had COVID and was recovering, we got invited down to a coach trip down to the Weald and Downland Museum, which is down in the southeast of England, by Chichester, and it's essentially very much the same as the Avon Museum that we have in nearby Bromsgrove. It's a collection of historic buildings from the southeast of England that have been taken to pieces and re-erected on this site. In fact, I believe there is only one original building on the site. The rest of them are all rebuilds, if you like, but they're basically capturing the history of buildings in the area, and they've got historic gardens with them as well. There's a visitor centre when you arrive and a shop, and very nice cafe overlooking the lake, and there's a small exhibition in that area where they give you a history of the museum, and there are some sort of interactive displays. But most important of all, what I'd come to see really, this is where they shoot the television series of The Repair Shop.
He was an educationalist and co-founder of the Weald and Downland Museum. Here, you can hear Roy talk about his plans with Chris Sawyer, who was an early volunteer and for many years our museum director.
I wonder if we could talk for a moment about the early days of the museum, the foundation.
But on the way in, you've got all these examples of construction methods and examples of how things are made in the buildings, different types of timber frame buildings and that sort of thing. And then you can walk around, there's a pathway around which has all the different buildings, and you can just walk around. Some of them have guides in there which tell you all about the buildings, and it's quite interesting just to see how people lived in 16th, 17th centuries, the sort of conditions that they were living in, the differences between the houses of the rich and the houses of the poor. And you can see the way the buildings are constructed, which was of particular interest to me because with a background in construction, it's interesting to see how things have developed, and in some cases come full circle. You know, we're back nowadays in a situation where the majority of new build housing is timber framed, pretty much the same as it was in Tudor times. We were fortunate with a reasonably nice day, so it was pleasant enough to walk around. And as I say, we were just coming out of COVID, so we weren't particularly fit and healthy, but I think we had a good enough couple of hours or so there to be able to explore the place and not get too worn out. We've also got examples of mills and workshops, and again they have teaching workshops there they hold on different subjects. I think when we were there was a beekeeping one, I think, sawmills, a dairy. There's a pit that you used to go into and hold the bottom end of the saw, and somebody above it was lifting up the saw, you know, just seeing how things were done before machinery effectively. And it's the sort of thing you tend to forget. I just come out into the shed and get a bandsaw out and cut a piece of timber, and you forget that people did it by hand. The repair shop site itself, as I say, is pretty much roped off and not accessible, but you can go down the side and get reasonably close to see the actual barn that they're using for filming. It somehow didn't seem to look quite as big as it did on the television, but I think a lot of that's down to wide angle lenses and things like that. But nevertheless, it was good to see the site of a programme that is so inspiring to a lot of the things I do. There's blacksmith's forge adjacent to it, which I only saw appear on the television programme a couple of weeks ago. That hasn't been sort of shown before. There's the mill, which is one of the buildings they've recreated. They have daily demonstrations there. There's a water mill that they've rebuilt, and they explain all about that while you're there and milling. They've also got animals there at the museum. They've got heavy horses there, sheep, lambs, chickens, geese, and they use the horses in demonstrations as well around the museum. As I mentioned, they've got historic gardens showing transitions in the way the gardens have developed over the years. There's the tin tabernacle, which is very similar to what we had at the bottom of our road when I was growing up as a child. We had one of these tin churches. As I mentioned, that we have got a very similar arrangement close to us in Bromsgrove, which is the Avencroft Museum, but it's not quite such a big site, and they haven't got the range and variety of buildings that they have down at Weald and Downland. The plumber's workshop, which was interesting to see. Again, seeing people working with lead and things that nowadays wouldn't be allowed. And the other noticeable thing was the sheer number of people that were living in such small houses. You had very tiny houses with 6 and 7 and 8 people in, and beds with drawers underneath them that were pulled out for children at night and all this sort of thing. Very sparse living conditions that we've grown to accept all the modern conveniences that you somehow forget that used to be open fires, cooking ranges in the kitchen, and 2 up, 2 down literally. The museum's about 40 acres in all, I think, and they've got over 50 buildings there. I think the earliest one's around 1000 AD, and they've got walks around the site, as I mentioned. It's a foundation, it's an independent museum, and the aim was to establish a centre that would rescue examples of buildings from southeast of England and sort of increase public awareness of them. And it principally promotes sort of retaining old buildings on their original sites unless there's no alternative. But then again, they run courses in conservation and that sort of thing, which is of interest. The Open Air Museum itself was opened in 1970, and has sort of gradually grown over the years since. There's a charcoal burners camp as well, which is out in the woods, that shows how charcoal is made. It's a schoolhouse, and again it takes me back to my early days in a schoolhouse that is so different to what you'd expect to see nowadays when you went. Shepherd's hut. That's people used to go out and live with the sheep while they were lambing out in the hills. And there's also a collection of old carts and agricultural machinery, a lot of which was made by J.C. Bamfords, who are nowadays better known as JCB. So there's quite a progression from small agricultural machineries to huge diggers, really. It's also been used extensively by television companies as background in things, and to have programs in addition to the repair shop. You know, people like the Hairy Bikers have done shows there, and they've had historical documentaries filmed there, all sorts of things like that. It was interesting to see the mushrooms that you see at the side of the road very often and decoratively outside houses, actually in their proper use as supports to a granary barn. And I can only assume, I don't know, but I assume that they're there so that the rats can't climb up into the barn to get at the grain. The other thing that's noticeable is the door heights. You can see how people have grown taller over the years, in that the building doorways, many of them are almost impossible to get into without ducking quite a long way. There was a cider making course as well being run at the time, with a lot of students learning all the ins and outs of cider making. I think the outside they had a practical demonstration that they were getting ready for, that was actually going to make some cider. All the apples were there being mashed up. It's a contractor's van that used to be pulled by the steam engines and road rollers that again people would effectively live in while they were working. As I say, the charcoal burners were out in the woods along with a big crane and a sawmill. Beautiful countryside, nice rolling hills, very agreeable for a picnic. So a treadmill for winding up from a well that people would climb in and walk around. Perhaps the most interesting building, as far as I was concerned, was the grid shell, which was built in 2000, early 2000. It's a Millennium project, I think, but effectively it's a space that they use for exhibitions and training and as a workshop. But it was an incredible building, very much the same as the inside of a Wellington bomber, only bigger. It's a Normandy oak grid shell that they'd made, that's produced. It's a sort of a self-supporting, huge spanned building. but it was really interesting to see modern construction techniques being used, and it was a pretty impressive space. So effectively that was the day out, because we'd got a fairly long journey back, but being by coach, it meant, despite feeling a bit under the weather still, it was a fairly easy run back. So if you are ever down in the East Sussex sort of Kent area, it's well worth a day's visit. Hope you enjoyed the video. Look forward to seeing you next week when we'll be doing something different, I hope. I'll see you then. Bye!